Our presentation is on the comparison between Sweden and the United States. So Sweden is a civil law country, and it is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary form of government, and Sweden does not have a constitutional court. The United States has a common law system and an adversarial law system. The United States Constitution establishes the judicial branch of the federal government and specifies the authority of the federal courts. So the courts in Sweden, they have two parallel court systems, the general courts that are comprised of district courts, courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court, and all the general administrative courts that are comprised of county administrative courts, administrative courts of appeal, and the Supreme Administrative Court. Sweden has 53 district courts, 6 court of appeals, and then the Sweden Supreme Court. The United States has 94 district courts with at least one in each state, and there is no appellate jurisdiction in the United States. The United States Court of Appeals presides over cases where either one or both parties are dissatisfied with the outcome from the district courts, and there are 13 Court of Appeals in the United States. The United States Supreme Court is the highest court system in the United States, and there are 51 Supreme Courts. So this is just an image of like the court system in Sweden. So it kind of shows the general courts and the administrative courts and just like a pyramid of how they work. So Sweden and the United States Supreme Court, these are just some differences. In Sweden, the Supreme Court consists of 16 justices who are appointed by the government, whereas in the United States, the Supreme Court consists of 9 justices who are elected by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. In Sweden, the Supreme Court is the third and final step in all civil and criminal cases. The government is not able to interfere with the decision of the court in Sweden, and lower courts are also not obligated to follow Supreme Court decisions in Sweden. In the United States, the Supreme Court is the highest federal court, and the Supreme Court has the ultimate appellate jurisdiction over all the federal and state court cases involving issues of federal law and original jurisdiction over a small range of cases. So in Sweden, there's 3 different forms of arrest. The first form of arrest describes the form which is a provisional measure pending a decision to detain someone. In urgent cases, a police officer may arrest a person without detention order, providing that there are reasons for detaining the person. The second form of arrest is that an arrest can also be an enforcement measure for a detention order or order for remand and custody that has been issued against someone at large. And then the third form of arrest is that this is called like the citizen arrest, and this allows for not only officials but anyone at all. They may arrest a person caught in flagrant for a crime punishable by imprisonment or a criminal suspect wanted by the police. So after an arrest is made, the public prosecutor is then informed about the arrest and decides whether the arrested person should be detained or not. Oh, shoot. Okay. So then after the arrest, there comes like the right to counsel in Sweden and like the United States. So in Sweden, no matter the severity of the case, you're always guaranteed the right to counsel. You're guaranteed the right to be assisted by a defense counsel, and you get to choose who this is. If the suspect is deprived of liberty by being detained or remanded in custody, the condition for appointment of a public defense counsel will be met. If the suspect is not arrested or remanded in custody, a public defense counsel is appointed by the suspect, or is appointed if the suspect requests one, or if they are suspected of a crime punishable by at least 6 months of imprisonment. And in the United States, in criminal cases, a defendant has the right to counsel, but in order to be appointed a public defender, you have to meet certain requirements. And in civil cases in the United States, you don't have the right to counsel. So then there's prosecuting in Sweden, and police and prosecutors are responsible for conducting investigations to determine whether an individual should be prosecuted for a crime. And after investigating, prosecution is mandatory if guilt has been established. A defendant is then entitled to counsel as soon as reasonable suspicion is established during the investigation stage. And any witness that has been brought in may be interrogated for up to 6 hours. In Sweden, there's no right to bail, although individuals who are released without detention may have travel restrictions by court order. So a little bit about pretrial in Sweden. Sweden, they have like pretrial detention. The Swedish legislation does not stipulate a maximum period of pretrial detention. And in Sweden, pretrial detention is ordered for suspects of offenses carrying prison terms of over a year. Over 25% of inmates in Swedish prisons are in pretrial detention today, which is a lot higher than most European cities.
Okay, so I will be talking about Sweden's courts as well, along with the criminal trial process between Sweden and the United States. So Sweden has two types of courts, that is general and general administrative, as Brooke was talking about. General courts deal with criminal and civil cases. Sweden also has special courts, which are designed to hear specific cases like we have in the United States as well. Some of those courts are the labor court, market court, rent and leasehold tribunals. And higher courts will hire only professional judges to hear the cases. And trials in Sweden occur without juries, so they include a judge that makes the decisions. Normally they have judges called lay judges, which are 3 to 5 judges that make the decision. So Sweden's judges, in order to become a judge, you must obtain a Master's of Law degree. After graduation from law school, most commonly, they become a law clerk for about a year or two, and they work either in the district or county. Following being a law clerk, it is common for them to become reporting clerks either in the Court of Appeals or Administrative Court of Appeals, and that's usually for a year of service. And then after becoming a reporting clerk, they are appointed to an associate judge. So this is a non-permanent position, however, they can be appointed later on by the government. Once appointed to a permanent position, they can be appointed either to the district or county administrative court judge, Court of Appeals judge, or Administrative Court of Appeals judge. In Sweden, they have judges known as lay judges. They also work in district court, Court of Appeals, county administrative court, and Administrative Court of Appeals. They are appointed by a municipal council of each court, and they also have the same responsibility for court's decision as a legally qualified judge as well, and they serve 4-year terms. So a little bit about prosecution in Sweden. Their role is to prove that those accused of a crime are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They also have 3 main tasks, which include investigate crime, represent the state in court, and decide whether or not to proceed with legal proceedings. Prosecutors usually spend 1 or 2 days a week in court as well. In Sweden, they also have public prosecution contains the Sweden Prosecution Authority and Swedish Economic Crime Authority. So I'll talk a little bit more about those. The Swedish Public Prosecution Authority contains 900 prosecutors. They also have 7 geographical areas and a national public prosecution department. And they deal with cases with the environment and conducting methodological and legal development in crime areas. The Swedish Economic Crime has more than 100 prosecutors involved, and they deal with economic crime of Sweden, so things like bookkeeping crime, tax crimes, and crimes against financial interests of the European Union. Public prosecution service in Sweden. It requires them to have a Bachelor's of Law degree along with a Swedish court clerk merit rating. This is achieved either at the district or administrative court. In their first years of employment, they must complete a training, and this training involves theoretical and practical training program. And the Prosecutor General of Sweden is the highest ranking public prosecutor. They are the only prosecutor allowed to institute proceedings to the Supreme Court as well. And the task of the courts in Sweden, it is a right in Sweden to have cases heard in an impartial court, and they want to decide cases and matters effectively and efficiently. Courts are independent of each other, meaning no other government court or government can dictate how the courts rule. They have their own choice in how they want to rule. And also in Sweden, which is different from the United States, there is no plea bargaining. So everyone who is prosecuted must stand trial in Sweden. A little bit more about the defense counsel. It is appointed when necessary by the court. You must be a member of the Swedish Bar Association and a trained lawyer in order to be defense counsel. The public helps pay for this assistance as well. And if the defendant cannot afford can't afford a lawyer, they usually hire a private attorney. And in this case in Sweden, they don't have to have any legal training if they decide to hire a private attorney as well. Okay, so victims of crime in Sweden, they are also entitled to free counsel as well. And in the district courts and court of appeals, there are also volunteer witnesses that help victims of crime and witnesses at trial, so they just volunteer to help them out. And then also something different from the United States, in Sweden, victims of an alleged crime are known as a plaintiff in trial, which is a lot different from the United States as well. So judges of the United States, justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, circuit, and district judges are appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate. They serve on good behavior or life term, depending on their circumstance. Those who are appointed to the Supreme Court are obviously very exceptional lawyers, either law professors as well, lower federal court, or state judges as well. State judges are selected based on the state and type of court. Most common selection is popular election. In both federal and state, judicial candidates are almost always lawyers with many years of experience. So the United States lawyers, we also, like Brooke said earlier, an adversarial process. They are responsible for representing their clients' evidence and legal arguments to the court. And then based on their presentations, a trial judge or jury determines the facts and applies the law to reach a decision. And then individuals are also free to represent themselves if they wish to, but most of them do get a lawyer if they can afford one, because they're often necessary to present cases very effectively. Most states require lawyers to obtain a law degree from an accredited law school. After the 3-year course study at law school, they must pass the bar exam in order to practice law. And if an individual cannot afford an attorney, there's also legal aid that helps out with other legal assistance, like Brooke said, and public defenders are also appointed to indigent defendants who are accused of a crime. Okay, so now I will be talking about the criminal trial process in Sweden and how it differs and compares to the United States. So the function of the courts in Sweden is to consider whether the prosecution is successful in proving their case and proving that the accused person did commit the crime they were charged with. In district court, they have 3 lay judges, and that is if the sentence is expected to be more than a fine, so either jail time or prison. So first off, the prosecution presents its facts. So they present an account on what they alleged has occurred, and they usually also go through written evidence at this time. So like I stated earlier, the victim of the crime is actually known as a plaintiff in Sweden, and during this time, plaintiffs can claim damages from the defendant as well. After the presentation of facts by the prosecutor, the plaintiff is now heard. This is also known as examination of the plaintiff, and both parties can ask the plaintiff questions. And sometimes during this time, the plaintiff will have a legal advisor to help advise them when answering the questions too. Okay. After the examination of the plaintiff, the defendant then can respond to this So the defendant itself or the defendant's lawyer responds to the questions and kind of responds with what they think has happened in their case and whatnot. And then after this, the examination of witnesses happens. Witnesses are called to the stand, and parties and judges can ask the witnesses questions. Following this comes the defendant's personal circumstances. So things are presented about the defendant, such as if they have any previous criminal records, finances, and documents. This process is for the judge to determine how heavy their fines will be, if any, and the cost of defense counsel based on their circumstances that they have. And the final stage of this is the deliberation. This is where the judge or judges discusses the case and will come up with the verdict of the case. So now moving on to the criminal trial process in the United States. So the burden of proof relies on the government, and defendants obviously do not have to prove their innocence. It is up to the prosecution to do that. A defendant must be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And during a trial, prosecutors must present evidence and witnesses to prove to the jury that the defendant committed the crime, just like in Sweden. And it's actually up to the jury to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not, based on the information provided by the prosecution. And most defendants are also represented by an attorney as well. So the first thing that happens in the trial process in the United States is jury selection. So 12 jurors are randomly selected from a pool. And then once jury selection occurs, it's the prosecution and defense opening statements. So the prosecution goes first. They're the one bringing the case to trial, therefore they go first. So both sides explain their sides of the story. It's often short and does not involve any witnesses or evidence. And like I said, prosecution goes first. And then after that is the presentation of cases. So the prosecution first calls witnesses to the stand. This can last a few minutes to several days depending on the case. Cross-examination of witnesses also occurs during this time. And the cross-examine's purpose is to put doubt of the credibility of witnesses. And then once the prosecutor rests his case, no more witnesses are allowed to be called to the stand, along with evidence maybe not presented to court. So after prosecution's presentation of his case or hers, the defense may present witnesses and evidence if they choose to, and the defendant is not also required to testify. However, if they choose not to testify, some may be skeptical that they are guilty of the crime because they chose not to. During cross-examination, either side may bring up objections that they'd like to, either on a piece of evidence or question, and the judge is the one that decides whether to act on the objection or proceed forward. After the presentation of both cases, both sides will conduct their closing arguments. Once again, the prosecution goes first, and this purpose is to summarize the case and to talk to the jury one last time before the jury ends up making a decision. Then after that happens, the judge informs the jury about jury instructions. So this helps the jury come up with a verdict that is based on the law. And the final stage of the criminal trial process in the United States is the jury deliberation and verdict. So this is where the jury comes up with a decision, and once they have made their decision, it is presented to the court.
So for the sentencing specifically in Sweden, the majority of people in correctional facilities are for drug-related offenses, and the court will usually design an enforcement plan for each inmate. It makes it individualized, and treatment programs are implemented for every inmate to reduce the risk of recidivism. Children under the age of 15 are not punishable under the law, and those that are between the age of 15 and 17 may be fined or sentenced to institutional youth care. Most offenders under the age of 18 are not usually sentenced to prison, and in contrast, in the United States, that does not happen. We have a juvenile court system and juvenile detention facilities, which anyone under the age of 18 will usually be admitted to. that it? Can we pause that real quick? So in Sweden, in their Department of Justice for the whole country, it's led by a Ministry of Justice, and this Ministry of Justice is primarily responsible for matters relating to the judicial system, including the budgets and administration of the government agencies. And the Ministry of Justice is also responsible for core legislation in the fields of civil law, criminal law, and procedural law. Despite this, the Ministry of Justice does not have the power to like intervene or interfere with the rulings of certain cases or the application of laws in those certain cases. Um, the Ministry of Justice is like the United States Attorney General or the Department of of Justice, and within the Ministry of Justice, they have senior officials, which is led by the Ministry of Justice again, and then within that, it's divided by people who lead each division for specific things like police issues or prosecution issues, or things also like things dealing with taxes or real estate and stuff like that. But for the United States, like I said, it's the Department of Justice is led by the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is appointed by the President, and which is confirmed by Congress. And the Attorney General's role is to represent the United States in legal matters and also just lead the whole Department of Justice.
So like adding up, we compared it all, and for me, I thought one of the like really big interesting differences was Supreme Court justices and how in Sweden they're like elected by the government, right? Yeah, and then like how in the United States it's the president who chooses, and then like the Senate also helps out with that decision. And I just thought that was interesting, like the difference on how justices are elected. Another difference that we didn't discuss so much was that in Sweden they don't have the stare decisis, whereas in the United States we do, and I also found that interesting. Um, it's actually a lot different than I thought they would be. There's obviously similarities, but a lot of differences between the two court systems and how things work in each country.
A couple of other things that stuck out to me was Brooke said in her presentation that in Sweden there is no bail, which in obviously the United States we have, which is obviously a big difference for us and everything in contrast. And then also another thing that really struck out for me was that in Sweden there's no plea bargaining, so that means everyone who is prosecuted must stand trial, which is so much different than the United States, where like almost 97% or higher cases don't even go to trial in criminal law because of plea bargaining and stuff like that. So definitely, I'm sure the economy doesn't help having there's no plea bargaining, so all the cases have to go to trial no matter what. So that was definitely a big thing that stuck out to me as well too.
For me, one of the biggest things was their sentencing laws. They don't sentence anyone, or usually don't sentence anyone under the age of 18, or try them as an adult, which I know that we do in the United States and has been done. And there's been like documentaries about it and a whole lot. So in Sweden, they have a whole government agency for crime prevention called the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention, and they really just support like local crime prevention efforts with like local police and schools and social services and things like that. And they also are a part of a European crime prevention network, and that is also is just a support system for Sweden and all of their crime prevention like efforts that they have.
Another statistic that really stood out to me as well was how 25% of inmates in Sweden are in pretrial detention, which I thought was like a big number, and it even said that is a really big number compared to most European countries. And I think like part of this reason is because they have no right to bail, and they have, um, like they're all just put in pretrial detention and sent to prison, and so that was a statistic that really stood out to me too.
Another thing that struck me too was the fact that the trials in Sweden don't have juries, so they're heard by judges or like one judge or lay judges where they have like 3 to 5 that hear the cases. So that obviously takes away. You don't like in the U.S. we have the opportunity to either have a bench trial or jury trial, and in Sweden they don't have that option. They get a judge and like if they wanted a jury trial and they feel like they could have more of a leeway in like a sentence or something or get more opinions rather than just having like one judge or 3 judges, that definitely takes away that. So it's definitely a big difference from the United States too.
Yeah, and also that like the lower courts are not obligated to follow Supreme Court decisions, which you would think they would be, but like they don't have to follow Supreme Court decisions at all. They make their own decisions. They have no juries. Yeah.
And another thing about Sweden is that because they're part of the European Union, they work a lot with other European countries, specifically on like crime prevention or like um, cooperating with the other police forces. And I think that that's a good thing for them to be able to have other country supports or other countries to hold them accountable. And we don't really have that in the United States. We're really all like just by ourselves.
And then also another difference is that I mentioned that in Sweden, victims of an alleged crime are known as a plaintiff, which is obviously very different with the United States. Plaintiffs are the ones that bring civil cases to trial, and a victim of a crime in Sweden is known as a plaintiff. So that can definitely get confusing if you're just learning about that or something, because that's obviously very different. This is criminal law that we're talking about, and that's what a plaintiff is called, the victim of a crime in criminal law in Sweden. So that's definitely a huge difference, and it's hard to compare those two because it's a huge difference. So.